This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 310 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Before I look at 10 things that are happening throughout the NFL and fantasy football, I wanted to remind you guys that FanDuel is offering a Gridiron Pick'em contest each week over on FanDuel.com. If you correctly pick each winner during the week's worth of NFL games, you get a share of that week's jackpot of $10,000. To play, head to FanDuel.com or download the app today. Now let's get to these trends. Trend 1 is that in Brandon Allen's first and only start this year, Denver running backs combined for an 11% target share. Phillip Lindsay didn't even have a single target. And for the record, the 11% target share is on 2 total targets. In their previous 8 games, running backs in Denver had a 27.5% target share. This is a really big deal for both Lindsay and Freeman, because both of those guys had pretty high floors in PPR formats. If this continues, you're looking at more touchdown-dependent players, which would suck because they're in a bad offense. Mike Evans has seen amazing target share numbers over the Bucs' last 3 games. 3 games ago, it was 32.7%, then 31.6%, and then 37.2%. And during this time, from week 6 through week 9, Evans is unsurprisingly the wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. But get this, guys, he's averaging 33.1 PPR points per game over this period. That's 10 points per game better than any other wide receiver. Michael Thomas is in second with 22.1 points per game since week 6. Meanwhile, this is hurting Chris Godwin a bit. He has 2 straight performances ranking outside the top 20 in weekly wide receiver scoring. But Godwin, during this 3-game stretch, he still ranks as the wide receiver 12 in PPR points per game. So let's not pretend that he's totally suffering. Duke Johnson has been a top 30 running back in each of his last 4 games, including 3 top 20 performances during this time. And much of this has to do with a rise in target share. He's averaging about a 14% target share over his last 4 games, when the 4 games before that saw him with about a 6% share. This sort of kind of aligns when Will Fuller got hurt, but Kiki Qt also isn't getting any run. The Texans just don't have a ton of alternatives in that offense. That's helping Duke Johnson maintain a nice target share. Speaking of the Texans, DeAndre Hopkins' usage is absolutely fine. He's actually seen better target share numbers than Mike Evans over the last 3 weeks. But how he's being used is becoming pretty tilting. Hopkins has a 9.9 average depth of target this year, which is essentially 2 yards shorter than he's ever had throughout his career. That's according to airyards.com. If you have Hopkins and you're sick of seeing like a 7-catch, 51-yard type of performance, this is why. He's not being targeted down the field. Even without Will Fuller, his average depth of target isn't changing. In fact, it's gotten a little bit worse. And that's not good for his fantasy output. Trend 5 is a quick one, and it's that DK Metcalf now has 3 straight weeks with at least a 20% target share. He's mostly solidified himself as a fantasy starter. But I do think that we should note and remember that Seattle faced Tampa Bay and Atlanta over their last 2 games. But for the most part, Metcalf can be trusted weekly moving forward. I've had a lot of Dallas Geodert trends on the show over the last month or so, but I wanted to bring him up again because he had sort of a down game on Sunday, while Zach Ertz finally rebounded. But in week 9, Dallas Geodert actually had his highest snap share of the season at 78.7%, and he ran 29 routes, which was also a season high. And his double-digit target share numbers have continued. He has 6 straight weeks with at least 10% of Philly's targets. Now, I didn't mention him on this week's 15 transaction show because I talked about him enough on that show. But he's still rostered in just 26% of Yahoo leagues, and people probably aren't going to be targeting him this week because the Eagles are on a bye. That number should be a lot higher. Based on his yardage total and comparing that to how running backs have scored with similar numbers over the last 5 years, Leonard Fournette should have 6.2 more touchdowns than he currently has. That's the largest discrepancy in the NFL right now. And to give you guys some context as to how outrageous this lack of scoring is for Fournette, if you do the same exact exercise for running backs over the last 2 years, the largest gap in should have touchdowns versus actual touchdowns on the negative side was Jay Ajayi in 2017. He should have had 4.8 more touchdowns, which is 1.4 fewer than where Leonard Fournette is at right now. And Leonard Fournette hasn't completed the entire season. To reiterate what I've talked about on the show before, regression is not about an overcorrection. Leonard Fournette won't all of a sudden score 3 touchdowns per game to make up for what he hasn't scored. But we absolutely should continue to assume that he'll get back to normal and find the end zone. Week 9 was just a little bit difficult because the offense couldn't move the ball very well. Trend 8 is that in Week 9, Darren Waller saw a 7.4% target share, his lowest mark of the season. It was just the first time that he saw a share under 15.6%. I wouldn't look all that much into this, though. I wouldn't be worried if I had Waller on my fantasy team, which I do on multiple teams. He actually had his second highest snap share of the season, and he still ran 26 routes in that game. I would be shocked if he were to maintain this low of a target share moving forward. Damian Williams played 72% of Kansas City snaps on Sunday, which was his highest snap rate of the year. He also handled 75% of the team's running back rushes, which was his second highest rush share of the season. It's hard to say that Damian Williams is back, but that's certainly not a bad sign. If you've got him, you're definitely holding on to him this week with Patrick Mahomes coming back. I'm not sure that we should just automatically lock Damian Williams in as a sell candidate because of how he performed this past week. Because we saw him with legit top 5 upside down the stretch last year. We know what can happen when a player in this Andy Reid offense sees pretty good volume. So I think that Damian Williams is still more of a hold given this trend. The final trend this week is that Devin Singletary handled 64.5% of Buffalo's running back carries on Sunday while seeing a 20% target share. He's had that high of a target share in the past, but never combined with that big of a rushing share. This is something I brought up a lot on this show, but Singletary has been a player who's had a chance to capture a larger workload in his backfield all season long, at least when he's been healthy. And it looks like Week 9 was the turning point for that to happen. If you listen to last week's matchup show, which was probably the worst matchup show that I've ever created, I didn't predict it happen in Week 9. So I'm certainly not victory lapping this performance. I'm just noting that this trend was something that was foreseeable before that Week 9 game. Because we knew that Singletary didn't have a lot of competition in his way for more work. He's looking like an RB2 from here on out. And thank God, because some of my fantasy teams need it. Not that you care about my fantasy teams. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, do me a favor and leave a rating and review. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back in your ears tomorrow with the weekly matchup show.